We had decided to follow one animal day after day, from sunrise till dark, never letting him out of our sight. Now we became the first to discover what we had only suspected from occasional sightings. The large male orangutan does almost 100% of his long-distance traveling on the ground.
This is Origin Stories, the Leakey Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. 50 years ago, in November 1971, a young scientist named Biruté Mary Galdikas arrived on the Indonesian island of Borneo to find and study the most mysterious of our great ape cousins, the orangutan. She was the third in the group of now world-famous scientists known as the Trimates, the first women to successfully establish long-term studies of great apes in the wild. Jane Goodall in Tanzania, Dian Fossey in Rwanda, and Biruté Galdikas in Borneo. It's hard to overstate their impact. Their work formed the basis of everything science now knows about chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. And they've inspired generations of researchers and conservationists to follow in their footsteps. Today on the show, we're celebrating Dr. Biruté Mary Galdikas and her half-century of field research and orangutan conservation work.
Sapina, I thought we were friends. Remember all the goodies I've given you?
Dr. Galdikas is the founder and president of Orangutan Foundation International. She's a research professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. She's a 19-time Leakey Foundation grantee, and she was one of Louis Leakey's last protégés in his lifetime. But her story starts way before she met Louis Leakey. Biruté Galdikas grew up in Canada. Her parents were immigrants from Lithuania.
When I was a child, I lived in Toronto, and this was many years ago because, I'm 75 now, and there wasn't much light pollution. And my parents would allow me to go into our backyard, and I would lay there in the early evening and look up at the stars that, glistened and glimmered above me. And I was maybe 5 years old, and I asked those questions that many people ask when they're young and even when they're older. Who the heck are we? Where did we come from? And as I grew older, I began to realize that our lineage was one of the great apes.
In high school, Biruté came across a photograph of a Sumatran orangutan that was looking straight into the camera.
And from the lower lip up, he looked so human that you could have almost mistaken him for a human being. And that photograph is what gripped me. And that's when I started being interested in orangutans. And of course, please remember, 60 years ago, nobody knew anything about orangutans. I mean, people didn't know if they were solitary, they were social. They didn't even know if they were fruit eaters or leaf eaters. They were the mysterious ape. That mystery caught a hold of me.
She knew she had to somehow find her way to Southeast Asia to study orangutans herself. Fast forward a few years, and Biruté Galdikas was a young graduate student in UCLA's anthropology program. And one day, her archaeology professor invited Louis Leakey to come give a lecture to her class.
As it turned out, the interest in the lecture was so great that the university moved the lecture, and a huge crowd gathered. I mean, there were people banging on the doors because all of them could not get in after the doors closed. And Louis Leakey, he kind of spoke like a preacher man, an old-time silver-tongued preacher man. I mean, he could really hold an audience with his speech and the way he told stories and anecdotes. And during the question and answer period, he really caught on fire. And, he was very dramatic. He patted his shirt pocket, and he said that he had just received a telegram from Dian Fossey that a wild gorilla was tying and untying her shoelaces. And he explained who Dian Fossey was, somebody that he had helped go to study mountain gorillas in Africa. And as he spoke, the realization came to me that this was the person. This was the person who would unlock the universe for me. So I waited and waited and waited. People crowded around him, asked questions. People sort of faded away. And then I was left maybe with one or two other people by myself. And I approached Louis Leakey. And I told him, I want to study orangutans. Will you help me? And as Louis Leakey looked at me, and I looked back at him, we recognized each other. It was like we had known each other for millennia. And then he said, I am leaving for Africa tomorrow. Write me a letter. Keep in touch with me. And I said, well, where do I write? What's your address? And he said, just write Louis Leakey, Olduvai Gorge, Africa, and it'll get to me. So I thanked him and I walked away. And I knew as I walked away that my dream, my vision of going to Southeast Asia was now a reality. Then I got home and my mother was all excited. And she said, somebody had called on behalf of Louis Leakey, and you are to go to Westwood and meet him there.
The person who called was a woman named Joan Travis, one of the founders of the Leakey Foundation. She said that Louis's trip had been postponed, and he wanted to meet with Biruté.
So the next day, I went to Joan's house, sat on the sofa with Louis Leakey, and he interviewed me. Now, the other thing I have to tell you is, even if I had not met Louis Leakey, I would have gone there on my own, and I would have done it. I mean, I know this, I'm convinced of it. But Louis Leakey was the path that made it easier for me. He was the one that opened up the universe.
Even with Louis Leakey's support, it was 3 years before Biruté was able to go to Borneo to start her life's work.
And when you are in your early 20s, 3 years seems like an eternity. Now, if somebody said to me, you have to wait 3 years, I know it will pass in a blink of an eye. It's a long time, but it's not forever. Well, that 3 years stretched like an eternity. It reached the point where I didn't even want to go to UCLA because people would see me, and as I stepped out of an elevator, they'd say, oh, you've come back from Borneo. And I had to admit that I hadn't even gone.
As she waited and made her plans, people kept telling her that it would be impossible to study orangutans in the wild. The forests were too remote, dense, and swampy, and the orangutans would be too hard to find. But she was determined, and once all the funding and supplies and permits were finally in order, Biruté and her then-husband, Rod Brindamore, set off to Borneo to begin what is now the longest-running study of any mammal, led by one principal investigator. After years of waiting, they finally arrived in central Kalimantan in November of 1971. Here's Biruté talking about that time in a lecture from the Leakey Foundation archive.
Borneo is now called Kalimantan, which means land of many rivers by the people who live there. Nothing characterizes Borneo so much as rivers, water, swamps, rain, and humidity. The humidity is about 90% much of the time, and in some ways, it is very much like living in a steam bath. Even today, there are few roads in Borneo, and almost all the travel is done by boat. The Tanjung Puting Reserve, where we conduct our research, is near the coast. Rod and I set up a 35 square kilometer study area in the Tanjung Puting Reserve by cutting a network of crisscrossing trails. Our main camp, Camp Leakey, is by the Socornia Cannon River, a rather small and narrow river which is frequently clogged by weeds.
Camp Leakey was a 12-hour journey by boat from the nearest town. At first, their only shelter was a hut made of bark that they had found abandoned by its previous tenant. The heat and humidity were oppressive, and the insects were relentless. They got sick with pretty much every tropical infection. They got malaria, cholera, typhoid, dengue fever, and more. They were often hungry, and they spent long, hard days in search of orangutans. Just 3 weeks after she arrived, Biruté rescued an adolescent female orangutan that had been captured by loggers. She named her Ahmad. She later wrote that the experience of rehabilitating Ahmad back into the wild had a deep impact on her and permeated her whole understanding of what an orangutan actually was. Soon after rescuing Ahmad, on December 25th, 1971, she successfully followed a wild orangutan for the first time. A mother with her infant. She tracked them all day and watched them settle into their night nest high in the canopy. Then she returned early in the morning to follow them again. She followed these orangutans for 5 days straight. This was the first major success in her wild orangutan research. Not only was she able to follow wild orangutans through the dense forest, she proved she could do it for days at a time.
And, our clothes were ragged, and clothes were wet, but we did it. We were there in Borneo. It was like a dream, I was actually there. I was actually seeing wild orangutans, following them. I was in the forest every day. We just did it.
Do you remember the first day that you actually looked into the eyes of an orangutan?
Well, the first day that I really looked into the eyes of a wild orangutan happened some months after I had been searching for, observing, following, and studying wild orangutans. And that was when an adolescent female named Georgina, after displaying, came down towards the ground and hung there and gazed at me, gazed into my eyes. She was curious, and I don't know whether she gazed into my eyes for 30 seconds or 5 minutes, but it seemed like forever. And Rod Brindamore, who was beside me, took one picture. And I remember the click of the camera. I mean, it was like a drum beat or like a sonic boom. It was so loud in the silence of the forest. And then she moved on, and I followed her, I think, for 10 days afterwards. And she never did that again.
How were you able to follow her?
Well, the thing about orangutans is in the canopy, they're relatively slow. If they are not running away from you, you can actually follow them, even if they're relatively unhabituated. Now, if they're running away from you, then it's difficult, because they can move fast, because they're up in the canopy, moving gracefully and smoothly, while you're stumbling along in the water and over the tree stumps and vines and roots. The forest floor is a difficult piece of terrain to navigate, especially if it's swamp. I mean, I followed orangutans up to my armpits in the black acidic waters of, the peat swamp forests where we work, and that was very, very difficult. I mean, waist deep was difficult. Even knee deep was difficult, especially if you sink into the mud underneath the water. So it's a different universe out there, I'm telling you.
Because so little about orangutans was known to Western science when she started in 1971, every observation was a revelation. Here's a recording of Biruté speaking about it in a Leakey Foundation lecture from the 1970s.
One of the most memorable things that happened to me during my first 6 months in the field was walking across an open field, an abandoned rice field, and finding a subadult male, I presume, crossing it. And it was raining. I had just cut my leg. And it was a very dramatic moment for me. Afterwards, I felt like rushing back to camp and, sending a telegram to everybody that I could think of. Guess what? Orangutans are capable of leaving the tropical rainforest. They're not totally restricted to it.
The fact that orangutans could and did walk on the ground sometimes was one of her early discoveries. She observed that they could spend as much as half a day on the ground, and that they build sleeping nests high up in the trees. She also soon learned that, unlike chimpanzees and gorillas, orangutans are more solitary than social. And once she started discovering things, her field notes became an unending series of eureka moments. Each individual discovery could have defined the career of a primatologist of that era, or even today, but put together, Biruté Galdikas' observations were astounding. She learned that orangutans mostly eat fruit, that adult males grow to be twice the size of females, and that they roam the forests alone. She learned that orangutans are mostly silent, but males occasionally make loud vocalizations called long calls. She and her then-husband Rod made the first known audio recording of an orangutan long call, which can be heard for up to 2 miles through the forest. It sounds like this. And that's not all. They kept notes on thousands of trees and tracked how often they fruited and which foods the orangutans preferred. She found that females live with their offspring and nurse them for a very long time. And notably, she was the first Western scientist to observe a wild orangutan giving birth.
Wild orangutans are born in a nest. The mother is alone. And the first 3 years, the orangutan infant will spend clinging to its mother's body, either to her side, to her shoulder and neck, or sometimes even to her head. By the time that an orangutan youngster reaches 7 or 8 years of age, it is in the process of being weaned by its mother and is also beginning to travel on its own, separated from her. One of the things that we discovered that surprised us was that, at least in the Tanjung Puting forest, the birth interval for orangutans is something like 8 or 9 years.
In 1974, she accepted her first Indonesian college students, who learned to follow orangutans and help collect data. And in 1975, her work began to make her famous. She was featured on the cover of National Geographic, just like her fellow Trimates, Jane and Diane. Soon after that, Biruté gave birth to a son, who she and Rod named Binti. Binti spent the first years of his life at Camp Leakey. In 1977, an ex-captive orangutan named Princess arrived, and Biruté cared for her alongside her son. Very quickly, the camp grew to accommodate more rescued orangutans.
And I must confess that despite our thousands of observation hours on wild orangutans, I learned as much about orangutans per se, about what they are and their potential from being a surrogate mother to a long series of baby orangutans. And this is what life is like living with orangutans. And initially this hut had 4 walls, and that blank space you see here is one of the walls that they tore down. And that used to be the back wall. Eventually, they tore down all the walls of the hut, and we were forced to move to an orangutan-proof wooden house. And now, some of these rehabilitants are getting quite big, and they occasionally manage to take the wire screening off our windows. It takes them about half an hour, but they can do it if they really want to.
In 1978, after 7 years of fieldwork, 7 years of living among orangutans in Borneo, she got her PhD. She had her first research article published in the journal Science, and she went home to visit her parents.
When my mother found out that after I got my PhD that I planned to go back to Borneo, she actually cried. And my father, who was a more stoic person, said something to my mother like, for heaven's sake, she's an adult. She can do what she wants. And my mother understood at that time, at that moment, that studying orangutans was not something that I was doing just to get my PhD. But it took her a little bit of time to realize that this was my life's mission. And when she realized that, she became extremely supportive. And in fact, she was the one who, as a volunteer, ran the Orangutan Foundation International, which I established a few years later. And without her, we couldn't have done it.
Although she's one of the founding mothers of modern primatology, her roots in archaeology influenced her work.
One of the reasons I went to Borneo and tried to understand orangutans is because orangutans are not our ancestors, but they're similar in some ways to our ancestors. I mean, we emerged from the canopies of the African forest, but orangutans stayed behind, and they're still there in the forest, and it behooves us to ensure that they continue to stay in those forests, that those forests that are our ancestral forests continue to survive and are not annihilated, which is the process that we are seeing right now with global climate change. So, we can't look in the eyes of our ancestors, but we can look into the eyes of an orangutan and see something. So, we look at our own prehistory. We look at our own archaeology when we gaze into the eyes of an orangutan.
Biruté returned to Camp Leakey, but Rod Brindamore didn't. The couple divorced, and Biruté continued her work with the help of her students. In the early 1980s, she married Pak Bohap, a local indigenous Dayak man who had worked as a research assistant at Camp Leakey in the 70s. They soon had 2 children together, a son, Fred, and a daughter, Jane. By this point, Borneo was home. As her work revealed more and more about the lives of orangutans, a troubling picture became clear. Orangutans weren't just hard to find. They were in trouble. Their fate was tied to a forest that was rapidly disappearing. She carried on doing her work. She racked up tens of thousands of hours of observations, cataloged hundreds of different foods, mapped out orangutan social structure, foraging systems. She documented their mating system and recorded their life histories. She published her findings in scientific journals, and she toured the U.S. on a Leakey Foundation lecture circuit with Jane Goodall and Dian Fossey, educating the public about the plight of the great apes. In 1982, after years of campaigning, Biruté succeeded in convincing the Indonesian government to make Tanjung Puting a national park. This brought more desperately needed protections. In 1986, she started the nonprofit Orangutan Foundation International to help protect orangutans, fund her research, and educate people far and wide about these endangered animals. By the late 1980s, up to half of Borneo's primary rainforest had been destroyed by illegal logging, massive forest fires, the needs of a growing population, and open-pit gold mining. The orangutan universe Biruté had worked so long to understand and protect was under grave threat.
And unfortunately, I suspect that universe is gone and will never come back again. These are animals who for thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of years had the forest all to themselves,
In addition to the loss of food, home, and habitat, destroying the rainforest fundamentally challenges how orangutans have arranged their social lives and spaced themselves away from each other. With less forest, you have more violent interactions between orangutans who might never have met each other. Another devastating blow is tied to one of Biruté's most groundbreaking discoveries. Orangutans have the slowest reproductive rate of any mammal. Orangutan mothers can only have one baby every 6 to 8 years, which makes it especially hard for orangutans to recover from population loss on such a scale.
The world has changed, and it's never going to go back to where it was. I mean, one would hope that it would, but I don't see it, despite the work of many conservationists. We save a bit of forest here, we save a bit of forest there, but the massive annihilation still goes on. It's like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And the world is still forging ahead to that day when the world's temperature will be 2 degrees hotter centigrade than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we're going to be in trouble. And so I try to do my little part by trying to save and protect orangutans and their forests in Borneo.
I don't even know what to say to that, but I'm wondering, in the face of all this, how do you move forward? How do you motivate yourself to keep working at this?
I motivate myself by looking into the eyes of an orangutan and realizing that they are much more vulnerable than we are. But we humans can do our part even more to mitigate climate change.
Over the years, Biruté Galdikas has lobbied the Indonesian government to introduce stronger environmental protections, and she's campaigned for consumer boycotts of palm oil products, and she's called for people to use less paper. And now, Orangutan Foundation International is focusing on planting trees.
8 people in our tree planting and rewilding unit have planted almost 500,000 trees since 2017. 8 people. We sometimes hire villagers to come in and plant. We also sometimes hire villagers to go out and find seedlings for us in primary forests with the permission of the government. So we practice what we preach. And if we had more funding, we would plant more trees, we would protect more land, we could actually buy land, although that's a complicated process in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but we could do it. And we plant and we plant and we plant. So just keep on going, keep on doing. And you make a difference.
So do you think that it's important for scientists like yourself to lean into activism? How do you see the connection between those things?
Absolutely. I think it's very important for scientists to get out there and speak to the public. Go and talk to people. Sit in front of zoo cages and talk to what's happening to the animals in the wild that are represented in those zoo cages, to just be out there. Do like politicians do, go into people's living rooms and talk about what's happening. And I think it would be very helpful if more scientists became politicians. But of course, the problem is that if you're a scientist, that's not your training. But it's something that was made very clear during my 50 years in Borneo, which, I still, in the study, which I still continue with orangutans. But the conservation work has come directly from my scientific work, because the science made me understand in a more clear way the issues that orangutans and forests face.
Over the 50 years of her study, the population of Bornean orangutans has declined by 50%. Some scientists predict that they can hang on for maybe another 50 years, but after that, their future is uncertain.
What's going to happen is the lowland tropical rainforest trees are going to die. So what's going to happen is the orangutans are going to be faced with famine. unless something is done, and I don't know what human beings will be able to do. They can't change the weather. They can't change the climate.
So with all of this kind of like bleak, actually really frightening, bigger than us kind of climate situation that we're facing, what is your hope for the orangutans in your life? Do you have hope for them?
I have hope, and I have hope because there's many people, not just me, but many people that are trying to work to save orangutans. And, we do the best we can. Like I said, we're a small organization, but we employ 250 local, mainly indigenous Indonesians in Borneo, and all of them work very, very hard. And the pandemic really has put a stopper in our tree planting program, but we still continue planting trees. We still continue our education programs. And I have hope. I mean, I'm a human being, and humans are eternally optimistic. But again, I don't think it necessarily depends on the scientists like myself or the naturalists. I mean, we really try. But it depends on the politicians who rule this world, who have the power in this world. I think we do have hope. It's just that now it seems bleak because the actors that we thought would move in that direction are not really moving in that direction. But if they started moving in that direction, then there is hope. But in reality, I'm just a person who sits in the forest and follows wild orangutans and tries to save them by planting trees.
Thanks to Dr. Biruté Mary Galdikas for sharing her work and her stories with us. Please visit her website, orangutan.org, to learn more about her 50 years of orangutan research and conservation work and to support Orangutan Foundation International. You can get involved and learn about planting native trees where you live. Origin Stories is a project of the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding human origins research and sharing discoveries. You can support this show and the science we talk about by making a donation to the Leakey Foundation today. Go to leakeyfoundation.org/donate. Every dollar makes a difference. This episode was produced by Ray Pang and me, Meredith Johnson. Sound design by Ray Pang. Our editor is Audrey Quinn. Thanks to Talon Blanchon for audio of Dr. Galdikas in the field and for recording our interview with Dr. Galdikas in his studio. And special thanks to Marcus Foley and Emily Patton for all their help. Archival audio is from the Leakey Foundation Archive. Our theme song is by Henry Nagel. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions and Lee Rosevere. We'll be back next month with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.